In this video, we'll assemble the Guatemala Dreams bag. In video 1, you will have completed the knitting. If you opted for a pocket, you should have already installed that based on the instructions in video 2 of the series. Now we'll move on to assembling the bag. Where the cast on and bind off were aligned and joined on the machine, that seam is the center of the bottom of the bag lining. Now we'll sew the layers of the lining together, running up from the center of the bottom of the bag up towards the fair isle. You may use any seam that you like, but I will point something out to you. The edges of the fabric consist of knots and bars. The bars are the longer, easier to find bits of yarn along the edge. They alternate with what we call the knots, tighter little edge stitches. Sewing the knots together produces a tighter seam with better contact than sewing the bars together does. I find that whip stitching the knots together makes a perfectly good lining seam. For this particular project, it's perfectly fine to continue that seam right into the main fair isle fabric, the outside of the purse, because eventually that's going to be covered up. Towards the top of the lining, just before the fair isle, of course, there are the increases that we made. Just seam them in the same manner, and I usually reinforce the very top where the last increase was made with a little knot. Now we can move on to the exterior fabric, the fair isle, and either use the same method or another more traditional seam if you prefer. But because we will be covering it with the rope, it doesn't really matter that it's invisible. When the seams are completed, tuck the lining fabric inside the fair isle fabric. Push the corners down very carefully so that they're straightened out inside the exterior fabric. That is, the lining corners are straightened out inside. So both layers should be laying down smoothly. And if you made a pocket, it should be near the top. It opens and shuts with no problem. Now there's a decision to make about exact positioning of the lining. Traditionally, the lining and the exterior are almost exactly the same size. Sometimes the lining is slightly smaller to allow for turn of cloth. That is the thickness of the two layers where they fold at the bottom. In this case, we actually knitted a few more rows of lining than we did of exterior. We knitted 60 of each, but there were 2 increase and decrease rows, so that's 4 extra lining rows total. Even so, the exterior fair isle fabric is longer than the lining because that's the nature of fair isle, to lengthen and become narrower. And becoming narrower is why we did the increases. So even if you push your lining seam all the way to the bottom so it touches the bottom of the exterior fabric, there will be a fair isle lip at the top that turns in and is part of the lining. That's on purpose so the lining doesn't peek out, but you have a little bit of leeway according to your personal preference. I chose not to push that seam all the way to the bottom. I was just now pointing out about where it falls. There's the real bottom, but the seam is maybe 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch above the real bottom. The reason for that is something I'm sure you've observed. When you fill a knitted purse with heavy objects, there's a tendency for the bottom edge to distort pretty extremely. I don't much like that effect. It's not very attractive and it's not very good for the fabric of the purse. Making the lining a little bit shorter cuts way down on the distortion. Here I loaded the purse with a couple of marble pieces of fruit, something you would never in a million years put in your purse. And even so, the bottom edge suffered minimal distortion. So certainly your purse and your keys and your phone are not going to cause the extreme drooping that we sometimes see in knitted purses. So the choice is yours. Before you finalize the shape and sew on the strap, either decide to push your lining all the way down to the very bottom of the purse, or let that lining seam stop 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch above the fold of the Fair Isle fabric. Making the second choice will allow the lining to do more of the supporting of the bag contents and cause less distortion on the exterior, but it will shorten your space. In other words, the volume of the bag is slightly reduced with this method. You could certainly make handles with I-cord. You could purchase handles, or you could use a ready-made ribbon or trim. And feel free to try any of those if you would like. But I'm going to show sewing on rope trim that was made to match. Actually creating that trim is its own separate video, so you will want to watch that before moving on to this step. We need to begin at the lower corner of one side of the bag with a knot and end at the lower corner of the other side of the bag with a knot. I can use this knot for one of them, but I do need to neaten it up first, so I'll do that. And then I need to tie another knot about here. What's below the knot will become a tassel on each end. Instructions for sizing the strap and getting the correct length are in the rope making video. When we begin sewing on, the tassel won't be complete. It will be a closed end full of ends of yarn folded over, a few open, and the knot. Align the knot with the bottom corner. We'll sew up one side of the bag, leave a space for the handle, then do the same thing on the other side of the bag, knot up. The rope trim is made of several strands of both of the yarns that were used for the whole project. I like to pick a dark strand from that selection to use for the sewing thread. Applying the trim to the fabric is basically whip stitch. It looks very much the best if you try to align your stitches with the twists in the rope. So go down to the right of where one twist ends, up to the left where a twist begins, pull your stitch snug. You may have to tweak the yarn into the correct position. It may not automatically fall there. That one almost did. Tighten up. Work through all the layers of the fabric for the sturdiest attachment. I'm going through 2 exterior layers and 2 interior layers, but in this order: Fair Isle, lining, lining, Fair Isle. So we're getting all 4 edges of yarn joined, and when this is done and completed, nothing can shift around. Your bag is a stable shape. Sewing the rope on like this is by no means a difficult process, but it does behoove you to take your time, make sure each stitch is positioned correctly, and double check it. The other critical thing is the tightness of the stitches. You want it to be good and solid, so quite snug, and yet not snug enough to distort the edges of the purse. I'm using a doubled strand of yarn to make it good and sturdy, and reinforcing it at the top by stitching 2 or 3 times around the handle at the top before knotting the fabric and weaving it in between the layers. Now, if you will give the yarn a little bit of a tug before snipping it off, it will be shorter than the distance that you allowed, and it will just hide inside when you pull it back. Sew on the second side in the same manner as the first. And now we finish the tassels. Do that by snipping off the end where there are folded ends and there may be some loose ends. Fluff out the twisted yarn so that the individual strands become obvious. And if you have a sewing yarn still extending from there and it doesn't join in the tassel very nicely, as mine is not doing, weave that in by pulling it through with the yarn needle or a latch tool. Sometimes the process of twisting the rope leaves sort of a messy end, and in order to make the tassel, you'll need to untie some assorted sloppy looking knots, but that's really not a problem. Usually you can get to them just fine and trim and make a nice tassel. Do remember to leave the knot at the base of the seam intact, of course. Now we have the trim from the side coming up to this point. It extends to become the strap. It fastens to the purse again at the arrow on the left, goes down the left side, and completes the trim. So enjoy your Guatemala Dreams bag. If you're looking for a written pattern, it will appear in winter 2021 in Country Knitting of Maine, News and Views magazine. If you enjoy knitting purses and bags, you might also like my fabulous felted bag collection. I will put a link to where it is available on my website in the program notes. This is for all gauges of machine. Contrary to popular belief, the standard gauge machine can be used. The felt made from it is just as nice as felt from any other machine if you handle it right. So stay safe and sane and happy knitting.